This project began in August of 2022, and I had this grand idea of building this display for my Space Marines, and I couldn't help myself but to make some very detailed plans. These would have made building this idea very easy, just using 10mm XPS foam, and it would have transformed where I keep my minis. Let me show you. The idea was to completely fill this space and then build other dioramas into other parts of the shelf. But my neighbour bought a new TV about 6 months ago and it set my mind ablaze. So my little idea for a diorama to fill a hole in the shelf got ramped up a few levels, and the plan is now to turn this into a fully playable board. But first of all, I've got some very important business to take care of.
Just laid plans of mice, you know.
Men.
What?
That's the plans of mice and men.
Yes, well, I don't think men have got much to do with it.
The first job was just to start hacking this thing apart so that the sizes of all the pieces were much more manageable. And the noise was abhorrent. Trying to make sure all the cuts were straight was a bit awkward. The polystyrene itself isn't a solid piece, which meant this process was far more difficult than was necessary. Eventually, I managed to get the polystyrene cut down into what I considered to be the main component parts, the base structure of this whole thing. This single piece is going to become the centre of the whole build, and it was time for some designing. My initial idea was that I wanted to have an archway built into this piece with a balcony so that the leader could stand atop of his troops barking his orders. This meant cutting a large section out of this centrepiece so that I could actually get into it to cut an archway out. Then it was time for some templates. These are exactly the same templates I used on my city board build. They are scaled to fit with 40k terrain, and with some ever so slight tweaks, they're incredibly versatile for building all sorts of terrain. I'll leave a link to that video and where you can get your own copy of these templates in the description. I used some of the offcuts of the polystyrene to help add a little bit more structure, but they weren't quite wide enough. Probably my fault for not cutting them so I used a couple of card shims and just glued them into place just to make sure that this as a structure wasn't going to bend or move. If you're like me and have to wear glasses, get yourself a pair of cheap calipers. These are a gift from the Emperor himself. Using that highly accurate measurement, I cut myself a couple of strips of cardstock. I use these for lining the centerpiece of this arch. This will save me a couple of steps later on. No need for cutting or filling the inner section of this arch. I can just get straight to paint. I just cut the excess off with a pair of scissors, and this thing fits snugly exactly where it needs to go. I lined the floor with the same kind of cardstock because there was some horrible nasty ridges on it, and I glued all the pieces together with Gorilla Contact adhesive. When I first saw the polystyrene, I knew I had an opportunity here to make two essentially giant steel doors. You know, those kind of doors that you have a little sign on that says, "Sorry, closed for lunch." I wanted to keep these angular pieces because I knew they would look quite interesting towards the top of the door. So I rescued two pieces from what I considered the spare piece of polystyrene, and I knew I wanted the centre bit to be solid, that I wanted something underneath that archway that was inspired by the kind of the 40k grimdark aesthetic. Something that screamed honouring those warriors who had passed before us. And I needed it to somehow fit in between these two columns. So back to the templates it was. And this was the result using some 10mm XPS foam. And I think it's a pretty good basis to start building outward. I've added some supports in the back so this thing can actually stand upright, and it's time to glue these pieces back on. I used Gorilla Grab Adhesive again, as it is my go-to glue for gluing two pieces of foam together where PVA just won't work. And I just need to make sure that I've glued these in the correct places using my envisioning tool so I can try and imagine what a door might look like here. And then finally, I get to have a look to see if the idea that's in my head is actually what I am building. I have an absolute ton of work ahead of me, but this is looking pretty good so far. I added a balcony and started blocking out a lot of the shapes that was needed to make this, well, look like a solid building. But the fact this was made out of foam made it very light. So I added a sterilised rock with some hot glue to give it a bit of weight. And where there were some gaps in parts of the foam, I filled them with hot glue as well, just to make it a bit more solid. That rock was covered with another piece of foam, and all the other shapes that I needed to continue blocking out on this piece were all done by eye. It was all just traced from one shape to another. Everything was glued together with PVA glue, the structure was all pinned, and I did the same to the two end pieces until I came to a horrible realisation. With the difficulty that I had cutting all these pieces down to size, there was no real way they were going to fit back together and all be flush, because all the edges were jaggedy and just weren't flat enough to make that fit work properly. So I found the flattest edge I could find and traced that out onto a piece of cardstock. This template of some card shims should solve that problem. But to make sure all the edges were actually flat, I needed to jerry-rig some kind of upright, flat surface that I could work from. And it worked surprisingly well. All the rough edges are now flat, everything fits together really nicely, and most importantly, I was able to control the size of each individual piece to a real high level of precision. But I did stumble across another problem that only alcohol could fix. My initial thought with this build was to make it so it fitted as a set dressing against the long and short edges of all the boards that I've been currently building. This meant that the whole fortress had to be extendable and reducible, and this extension wouldn't just float around in the air. I used a couple of 1 centimetre strips of foam board and some coffee stirrers just to add some extra structure to support this section. I used the same 1 centimetre strips of foam core on one side to create a platform that will allow me to slide the other one in and create enough support. These were both glued into place just with hot glue. I did use a couple of extra pieces of foam core just to create a dam so that the hot glue didn't all pour out of where I was putting it, but this worked well. That is a thing. After repeating that same process on the other side, I finally got to a point where I had actually built the idea that was in my head. I now had a 6-foot fortress and a 4-foot fortress, give and take, that could act perfectly as set dressings at any side of a board. But something felt a bit off. I wasn't completely sold on the aesthetics of this thing as yet, so I stuck it on a shelf and pretty much just stared at it for a month trying to figure out where I wanted to go next. I came to the conclusion that I didn't want this to just be a set dressing. I wanted it to be a monolithic structure and a fully playable board. So this door is not big enough. A couple of those ribs in the upper half have to go, and I need to build upwards. I added a 2.5 centimetre base to each of these 3 sections, but for now I just need to get to hacking away all of the pieces that I now know that I definitely don't want on this build. This was a pretty cautious procedure. I was using a fresh blade I was using it long, so I needed to be careful, but I also needed to make sure that I saved as much of the pieces that I knew I was going to need to add back to it in the best condition I possibly could. This was a pretty laborious process, but a necessary one. But eventually, I could just start sticking all these pieces back onto the building. And I did this as quickly and as simply as I possibly could, and just used hot glue. Inevitably, none of this is going to look any good. It's going to require a lot more work later on. But in terms of the aesthetics of this building and how I want it to work, all of this is unavoidable. Taking a break from the building, it's time to turn my attention to some giant steel doors. These were easily made using this simple template: sprayed silver, black wash, a quick dry brush and some pigment powder, and they'll fit in here like this. And now it's time to build upward. This might look like a really complicated build, but it actually really wasn't. The templates I've been using and all the work that we've already done gave me all the measurements I needed just to cut and fit 10mm XPS foam to make the whole thing work. But it is important to say I wasn't just doing this all off the cuff. I was actually working from a small sketch I did when I took my month off just to stare at it. And now it's just a case of rinse and repeat to build up the other side. So back to the template it was, but before I forget, I used the offcuts from the steel doors in a trench that I'd cut out in the bases so that the teeth in the steel doors had somewhere to actually fit into. These were simply just glued into place using PVA glue, and then I could get back to the final stages of actually building this fortress. And for the first time in this project, I actually used my brain. After years of crafting, I finally managed to figure out that if you're using a hot wire and you use two templates, one on either side of the piece of foam, you get beautiful, crisp, clean cuts.
Two splinter cannons shooting at them from this back guy here, hitting on threes. One miss, but sixes are sustained.
Excuse Liam and Joe, I was watching one of their live streams while building this. Their Garage Hammer style battle reports are a lot of fun. I'll leave a link to their channel below. I didn't use a ruler for any measuring of this part of the build. I wanted to replicate the side I'd already built as accurately as possible. So using some spare pieces of foam, I made a few guides that I could use as easy reference to make sure everything was glued in exactly the right places. Then with more PVA glue, I could start gluing everything into place. The little foam guides allowed me to put everything exactly where I needed it to be before I pinned it all together. Then I broke out the hot wire table again to start cutting some arches. 40k, we need arches. I cut some smaller pieces, some larger pieces, and of course I used the templates again. But I didn't stop there with the hot wire table. I used those foam bricks to build this. All of the bricks are based on an A-size paper ratio, and the bricks were laid completely randomly to make sure it fitted in with one of the boards that I've recently built. Then it was time for filler. And this was the point where I was very, very happy that I built this thing in 3 pieces, but I had also decided to abandon the 6-foot idea. I didn't want any cracks to be visible when it was being used as a display piece. So all these little crevices, cracks, nooks, whatever you want to call them, everything needed to be filled. Even though I abandoned the 6-foot idea, I could still use this as a set dressing on the short side of a board. I can use it as a display piece, but what's in my head now is I'd like to see this running through the center of a board and be able to play through it with 2 different environments on either side. But right now, it was time to concentrate on filling because there was an awful lot to do. This was followed up by sealing, painting and texturing the foam all in one go. I did this with a mixture of Mod Podge, gesso, water and some fine sand with a little coarser grain mixed into that fine sand. This was roughly a 50-50 mix of paint and glue with some water just to thin it down a touch, and the sand was mixed in so that I could just see the grain of the sand as I was mixing it. I didn't want to add too much to it, and this was the consistency. This went everywhere except for the bricks. They got the same mixture, less the sand. While everything was drying, I built and painted a small test piece to try and figure out how I wanted to actually paint this huge structure. I really wanted to focus the paint job on the process rather than the paints. As you can see, there's plenty of texture on this bit, so I need the paint job to be as simple as possible to make painting it as easy and as quick as possible. But for now, I'm going to turn my attention to attaching the doors. Gluing these things in would have been a bit complicated because there's little purchase area for me to actually attach glue. It would have also been quite difficult to keep them in the same place long enough for any glue to dry. So I opted to use a series of toothpicks or cocktail sticks, depending on how you use them. These toothpicks are slightly longer than the actual width of where the door needs to go and sit into. And because everything is made from foam, I can simply just push them through. Then all I have to do is just snip off the ends, a little bit of plaster, a little bit of paint. Perfect, easy solution. Then I can glue these 2 parts together. I hadn't painted the surfaces of all the parts that I knew were going to have to connect and be glued together. So armed with a little pot of Gorilla Wood glue, I proceeded to cover all of those connecting parts. And then to create a more instant bond, I grabbed hold of my hot glue gun and I ran a bead of hot glue all the way along the support section that we built originally for the extension parts. Once I had lined everything up perfectly, I proceeded to pin everything together. I then ran a bead of hot glue down the seams where these two pieces come together. Again, bit of plaster over the top, more paint. This will help create a really solid and instant bond, but please be careful with your hot glue gun. I wasn't, and this fucking hurts. Once everything was glued together, there was a couple of details that I needed to take care of. I bricked the floor of the balcony and magnetised this section because I've already got a plan on how I can extend the balcony forward. But more importantly, I needed to mortar all of the brickwork. This was done by watering down some of the filler we'd already been using. I mixed it to the consistency of a mildly thick soup, and then excessively covered the bricks with this liquid. And I mean excessively. I needed to make sure that this got into all of the cracks between every single brick. Then with a damp sponge, wiped away all the excess and used the sponge to help push the liquid into those cracks. This process was repeated a couple of times just to make sure I got the liquid exactly where I needed it to be. I didn't want to see any cracks in the final product. And I took the whole thing outside, hit it with a rusty can of Mechanicus standard